here's our host, Tian.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you from Beijing on CGTN. Today we'll bring you a World Insight special, Global Governance, Wisdom from State Leaders. As another annual G7 summit wrap up in France on Monday, it is fitting to reflect upon the question of leadership by looking back on interviews with a group of former heads of states. In the first part, I sat down with former President of Costa Rica, Miguel Rodriguez, who also served as Secretary General of the Organization of the American States, and also former President of Slovenia, Danilo Turk, who also worked as Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs at the United Nations. Last but not least, the former President of Cyprus, George Vasiliou, who was critical in bringing Cyprus into the EU. They did not hesitate to evaluate the quality of world leadership today. Gentlemen, you've been playing instrumental role in your own country's politics and been shouldering your responsibility for your generation of leadership. What do you make of the current generation, Mr. President?
I admire the current leaders.
For real or to be polite?
No, for real, because they are living in a very difficult atmosphere.
What do you mean by difficult?
Because we have been losing some of our assurances, our certainties that we had in the past. We were so sure in the 90s. Democracy, globalization, international institutions, rules that will allow nations to come together and to converge in their goals in favor of progress and human development. And now we're living in a time in which people have lost faith in the elites, have lost faith in, even in facts, have lost faith for sure in democracy and globalization, in international institutions. So to lead today, I think is much more difficult.
But I'm afraid that, Mr. President, that's exactly the trap they are falling into, because it's an election trap. It's a popularity game, in a way.
This is correct, and that is why I'm saying I can sympathize with the difficulty they face, but I do not approve with everything they do. And I am very critical of what we see nowadays in the United States. The United States has moved from a kind of a core of international stability to a source of international instability. And that, I think, has created problems for many countries, for most of the world.
Is it the time to think about, oh, the good old days? President Vasiliou?
No. This is not the right thing to do, because it's an easy way to try to evade questions. Every period had its problems, and every period had to be, for the politicians, there was a need to address the difficulties.
What were the problems of your generation you are facing then?
Well, one of the problems of my generation was populism.
Same right now, right? Populism.
Well, it's even worse in some ways. It is true that the times are different, that things are more difficult now, but at the same time, it is true to say that there is a lack of leadership in the world. For example, Mr. Kennedy with one of the present leaders, or Churchill, or things like that. It's not a question of comparing them like that, but there is no doubt that a lot of our current leaders, if you want to use the word leaders, the current holders of power, because leader and holder of power is not the same thing. A leader shows the way forward and makes sure that this way is implemented, or tries to implement it. A holder of power is interested in keeping his job.
It's two different, very different things in nature.
Yes.
And it's for very different purposes, as you may know.
Exactly.
What is making a leader, Mr. President?
Well, I would like to explain that when I say I admire leaders. I don't admire followers. When I said I admire leaders, I admire the ones that, given these difficult circumstances, are able not to go with the emotion, with the sentiment, with the passion of the people, but to try to rationally show the way, try to show that we lose if we leave some of the constructions that have taken so many years to mankind to build.
But that's easier said than done, isn't it? Of course, we have admiration for that kind of people, but you know, you just think about your own political career.
But, you know, it's better to lose a campaign trying to lead and to show the way than to win a campaign going against what you know has to be done for your country. Because at the end, the campaign, even if you lose it, shows a way, teaches a little, allows people to think a different way. So I'm not that sure that it's always winning is the best.
Also for you, Mr. President, you are trying to push your country into the EU at the time. It's not an easy discussion and negotiation, as we all know. So how did that happen? How you were trying to convince minds at home and also in Brussels that that should happen?
The funny thing is that at that time everybody was supportive of the idea of getting into the EU. But it was easy to say it and very much more difficult to implement it.
Yes.
However, the truth is that in order to get into the EU, we had to promise things that at the end we didn't implement 100%. Not me, but subsequently. But anyway, this is a story of the past. What is more important now is to realize that whether the current holders, prime ministers or presidents do their job well or not, or they say they do it well, but in practice they don't do it well, it's another story. The main thing that we have to address today is how do you deal with the major problems of the world, to start with the climate change, which we know is huge. Secondly, with the inequality. It is unacceptable as a human being to accept that 1% of the people of the United States should own what the rest 98% has. So the need to have policies that are more, they are taking care of these problems and they're facing them face to face and not answering them in a populist way.
The urgency, both of you mentioned, of pushing forward the right policies and make sure it will be implemented to the degree it should, is a challenge. You know that very well, President Turk, because you also work as the Assistant Secretary General of the UN in terms of politics.
Yes.
This is extremely difficult these days, particularly, Mr. President.
Well, this is certainly more difficult now than it was when I was working at the United Nations, because then, some 15 years ago and more, we were able to see a platform which was common. And that was a big boost to the United Nations with the Millennium Development Goals, for example, with reforms that were taking place, and so on. But now we are facing a much more difficult situation, because that sense of common purpose has evaporated in the world. Now, President Vassiliou has very nicely defined the two key tasks for the world: stop global warming, reduce the levels of inequality. These are the two tasks. These are the tasks which will provide a test for leaders within countries and internationally.
But now we see people export tensions at home, overseas.
Yes.
To have a substitute for the real solutions they need to have as leaders. Now, Mr. President, when you look at that, what would you say? You know, when you are facing difficulties, you have to quit or not come into the office anymore. But some of the active politicians these days, they are there not providing solutions, while at the same time creating problems by exporting tensions overseas without solving problems at home. So actually double the tensions, if I could use this mathematic way of thinking about it. Mr. President, what do you think will be the way for them to climb down from where they were or where they are and be able to think reasonably?
Well, I think it's something that will require perseverance, persistence on the part of everyone who thinks seriously about how to solve problems. We have to face the problems, to put in front of the people the solutions, to understand that our solutions are not necessarily the best ones because we don't have all the wisdom, that we have to interchange with the others in order to create a better solution than the one that we're proposing, but that we have to push for solutions that are serious, that really give the face to the problems. And I think that that's the only way. There is no magic on this. It's a gradual, persistent system of working toward making people realize what is good for them and convince them. And that takes time and takes a passion of working for the good of mankind and of being serious about it and to use the best knowledge that is available to present what are the best solutions.
In those days, it was easier to say, I want to solve this problem, but I have some time in front of me. By now, we are losing, we have no more time. The time is limited.
Let's focus on what's going on right now, particularly with the international institutions. What about that, Mr. President, since you work for the UN for several years? Are they still reliable mechanism anymore? Without them, what can we rely on?
Well, I think they continue to be necessary, but what is needed is a mobilization of global civil society. That's something that I'm missing nowadays. I think that the social media have spoiled much of the situation because they kind of trivialize things. People have opinions about everything, and it's very chaotic, really. What is needed is an articulation of a global civil society which will put pressure on political leaders. That's what we need. The international institutions, on the other hand, are an instrument. They are not kind of living beings. They can be helpful as instruments provided that there is an appropriate energy invested in them. Now, of course, the things are complicated and they can be helped in various ways. Mobilization of civil society at the global level is not going to come easily. It is emerging, but it is not coming easily. What I see as an interesting additional push is creation of additional competing organizations. I think for that reason it was quite good that China developed its Shanghai Cooperation Organization and later Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, because that relates to solving of problems and creating healthy competition to existing international institutions. I would like to see more of that because I believe that this sort of development helps mobilizing global civil society and defining the problems that we have with the necessary sense of priority. This is sadly lacking and has to be established.
Now we see a time of dramatic change. There, of course, are a lot of challenges, as we mentioned earlier, but there are also opportunities. At the time of geopolitical change, a lot of countries want to make sure there's going to be a new role for their own development and their new role for their own existence on the world map. How do you see this competition, in a way, that's going on right now? To what extent do you think competition can exist in good sense or in a friendly way, in a way that would push the world for the better? To what extent do you think competition already would become dangerous and would push us to way more geopolitical game?
Well, I think very briefly and very simply put, we live in a world where we need a simultaneous competition and cooperation. That's not easy to manage, but it is necessary to manage. We need to compete, but we need to cooperate at the same time. There are no natural allies anymore, and there are no forever friends, and there are no forever and natural enemies. We don't live in a world of enemies. We live in the world of competitors. We live in the world of competitors, and of course there are dangers also, but we shouldn't see the other as an enemy and friends as allies against somebody else. And that's the key to establishing competition within the framework of necessary cooperation.
We shouldn't, we can't, we'd better not, but that's the wish that we have. the realities are not necessarily all that beautiful. Is it, Mr. President?
That there is the international organizations is a name. In reality, they are as efficient as the main powers within those organizations. For example, take WTO. You may complain of this, of that, but at the same time, you must not forget that President Trump is trying to boycott the WTO. And that makes life much more difficult. And the same is valid also for other international organizations. Therefore, you cannot expect the solution of the problems, although I fully agree with what Mr. President Danilo said, that competition is important. Yeah, but to have competition, you must have persons that can really compete. It's not just that I am the greater power and I impose it, because at the end of the day, that imposition will turn against you.
Imposing and bullying.
Well, I think that imposition is simply not going to succeed. We are now in a situation where we are overwhelmed by day after day by tweets, by policy moves, by acts which show the spirit of imposition. Now, this, of course, can spoil, this can poison the international atmosphere to a certain extent. But I'm sure this is not going to succeed. This is not going to last forever. It is simply going to end at some point. And what is needed really is a combination of forces that would simply work as countervailing force. I see possibilities there, and when we talk about WTO, it's already important that China and the European Union cooperate on reform projects, that Japan can be brought into the picture as a cooperating partner for a better World Trade Organization.
I see.
So pressure has to move in that direction, and then obviously the politics of bullying and pressure is not going to succeed.
Do you agree, Mr. President?
Well, I think that one thing I would like to mention is that when I started saying that we are facing special problems today, I don't mind at all, I don't mean at all, that in the past we didn't have the problems. Living in society is difficult, organizing nations is difficult, having relations among nations is difficult. Humankind's history is full of problems and of wars, of mistakes, of failures. So that we shouldn't get pessimistic about this because we're living difficult times. Because we have lived, the humanity has lived worse times, many times. Today we have less wars in the world per capita than never in the history that has been able to be established. We have less people in poverty than ever before. We have longer lasting lives all around. So we have a lot of progress. And this should be the basis to be optimist about the possibility of keep on improving. And I think that, that we need a little bit of humility. Very often we lose sight that we have limits. We don't know everything. We have time limits. We have resource limits. We have a lot of limits. And sometimes, if we just look at all that has to be done and the difficulties that are in front, we can become negative. And that's terrible.
What I want to point out here is that, yes, we have less poverty in the world, for example. But at the same time, let us look at why do we have less poverty. Because China and India and other countries in the Asian world have tried to improve and alleviate poverty, while other developed countries have increased the unequal distribution. So you cannot take things as generally world problems. You have to look at them as country problems, and then you have to see how you fight those problems.
It's such a pleasure, gentlemen, talking to you on some of the profound questions, actually, that are facing us every day. Before we go, what do you think the leadership should be about today? Just one sentence, if you can. Mr. President.
I think it has to be about truth, about facts, about realities, about values, and about really talking face to face to the people of what is the problems that we have and what are the best solutions.
I see, Mr. President.
I agree. Truth is in the core. The problem is that truth can be quite inconvenient. So leaders have to be capable of addressing inconvenient truth. And that, I think, is the critical question nowadays. In a pluralistic world in which we live, that's not easy, but we need a kind of movement of forces that would be able to confront the inconvenient truth of global warming and inequality.
I see. Last but not least, Mr. President.
Basically, I fully agree with what the two co-presidents. You have to say the truth about the situation, and you must have the guts and the courage to implement it, irrespectively of the possible political cost, political impacts.
It's such a pleasure talking to the words of wisdom and men of wisdom in this sense. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and also to demonstrate in history your leadership. Thank you. Really appreciate it. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight Special on the leadership today. We have come to the second part of our special program, Global Governance. In this round, I sat down with two presidents from Latin America, former Mexican president and former Bolivian president. As trade tensions between the world's two largest economies remain unresolved, economists are warning of a coming American recession, which will undoubtedly also impact developing nations vulnerable to a global slowdown. With this in mind, I asked the two presidents about their views on the current state of globalization and the trade conflict between China and the United States.
China and Mexico have in common that we are suffering from a terrible attack coming from the President of the United States. The main point is this trade war is going to have an impact in the global economy as a whole. So that is going to have a negative impact in the economic growth with a lot of jobs, maybe 1,000 or maybe million of jobs are going to be lost, either in Mexico, China, or the United States.
Obviously, global supply chain has been changing as a result of the current quote-unquote trade war. Even in the Asia-Pacific region, we have seen not only between China and the United States, but also Japan, South Korea. We're also likely to see other hotspots evolved into trade disputes. So what do you make of that?
Well, it's certainly the first time we have had a U.S. government that instead of leading the world towards open trade integration is the leader of protectionism, because not only have they modified the trade arrangements south with Mexico, which will cascade down to Central America, Colombia, Peru, Chile. We have all copy-pasted the Mexican agreement. So if the Mexican agreement changes or is wiped out, it will affect everybody down south. But as you know, the current U.S. government has annulled the Trans-Pacific arrangement, the transatlantic, and it puts tariffs on Canada as well. So our protection is all over, and protectionism is contagious and is bad. And I think it's sad that the U.S., instead of leading towards open integration, it is better known now for walls, imposing tariffs, and deporting people. And I think it's quite a contrast with China, with the Belt and Road, which has to be made a belt and sea lane for Latin America across the Pacific, is showing a much better way of pushing forward in the 21st century towards integration. Because like you mentioned, when the giant of the world, the U.S., becomes protectionist, it's easy for South Korea to impose tariffs on Japan and vice versa, and Europe to the rest, and it's a bad example. And I think China has a unique opportunity to show the world that it can still lead on open integration as opposed to what the U.S. is doing.
But many are asking that question, exactly what you have just said. Are the rest of the world be able to hold to the bottom line that we used to have and not to follow the example of one economy, which of course is still the largest economy in the world, the way of doing things?
In real terms, we are only destroying an incredible value everywhere, economic value. So what we are expecting, what I expect is we need to obligate to the participants, in particular the government of the United States, to learn that nobody is able to win in a trade war. Sooner or later, we need to demonstrate that this is a zero-sum game. And the way to do that is, of course, preventing such kind of attitude and pressing in the political arena in the United States with the right instruments, acting together between China and other big players in the world. And the big player, the biggest in this moment despite China, is Mexico.
It's the game by the current administration in Washington. Divide and conquer. As simple as that. Bilateral. Let's just do bilateral. That's what's suggested. And therefore, all divided and all conquered.
I agree with you. But when China took the measures against the tariffs, American tariffs, for instance, China decided to block any purchase of soybean from America. That's a great measure. But as with just a small coordination with Mexico, Mexico could take exactly the same measure, and the measure itself could be much more powerful. So, but the American, as you were saying, are dividing, and Mexico became the main buyer of soybean that China was not buying anymore. So my point is, yes, Americans are trying to divide everyone else, but the people and countries suffering such kind of mistaken attitude could act in a more coordinated way, definitely.
But there's a difficulty to that, Mr. President. For example, there are mechanisms internationally and regionally in a way that for countries' economies to coordinate with one another, G20, APEC, and you name it. However, every of these organizations in the United States is a big participant at this moment. We've seen the U.S. trying to blockade some of the progress and consensus in these mechanisms. So if countries really want to consult with one another, bilateral is a very slow process. Arbitration power of the World Trade Organization will come to an end at the end of this year because all the judges will run out of their term.
Yes, the U.S. government, by definition, it is undermining all multilateral institutions. What President Calderon is suggesting is divide and conquer only works insofar as we are divided. What he's suggesting is that if Europe, China, Mexico, the rest of Latin America, at the same time, simultaneously, work in an integrated fashion against U.S. disintegration policies, then it would dramatically change that, because then they could not divide us. If everybody says, we are going to stop buying soybeans from the U.S. so long as they're protectionist, and China will buy more soybeans from Argentina and Brazil, and Mexico will buy from Brazil, then the U.S. would pay the price and the consequence. And I think this coordinated action needs to be taken in all fronts, because the way things are going, trade disputes are going to move on to exchange rate disputes, which are going to move on to monetary policy and interest rates.
And that is very
dangerous, and that requires the coordination that President Calderon is suggesting on the tariff retaliatory point aspects, on the exchange rate movements, and on interest rates, because the U.S. is large, but China, Mexico, Latin America, Brazil, Argentina, and Europe together are much larger than the U.S.
Some suggest Washington is betting on the mentality that we all have. They say it's a human nature, that nobody wants to step one step forward to the strong one, but rather want to hide behind others when dangers come. So that is the mentality some suggest that Washington is playing with right now.
It is a very important suggestion what President Calderon is saying. Imagine if at the next G20, he comes from a large country. He hosted the G20 in 2012. And that is the, before it was the G7, Europe, US, and Japan. Now at the G20, we have China, we have Mexico, we have Brazil, we have Argentina. Imagine if at the next G20, the G19 meet together the day before and decide to coordinate the defenses against tariff increases from the US, against, by the way, exchange rates. The US complains about exchange rate movements, but at the heyday of the financial crisis, the US was printing 1 Brazil GDP per year. That was massive amounts of printing. But since you cannot devalue the dollar against itself, nobody cared. But it was cheap dollars flowing around. So what President Calderon is suggesting is coordination on the trade tariff front, on exchange rates, on monetary policy and interest rates. If the G19, to say something, would take a common position vis-a-vis measures that can be given as a counterpart to the U.S., I assure you the reaction in the U.S. would be different as opposed to divide and conquer.
I'm talking about politics as well. Because who's going to stop Donald Trump? His own voters. We need to focus on those voters in all those states where the Republicans won. So coming back, Idaho, very Republican, redneck farmers. We need to push on them. We need to make them to pay the price because they are going to move all the way against Trump and say, hey, Mr. President, you're making a big mistake with us, trying to affect the Chinese and Mexican people. We are affecting us. That's politics, very pragmatical. It's the real field in which the decisions are taken.
Before we go, everyone, one sentence if you can, sir. What do you think is the ultimate solution to the deadlock of the trade situation worldwide?
The world's leaders in whatever fora they meet, including the G20, to regain the vital center and to have the large economies be the leaders in trade integration as opposed to the leaders of protectionism.
Mr. President.
Before, the trade war should be to be coordinated in order to prevent and block the American efforts to do it. Afterwards, we need to get the way in which the entire world understands that this is a zero-sum game, that nobody is going to win anything, and we all are going to lose a lot of economic growth and jobs everywhere. So we need to stop that, but saying to the people who are able to vote and so that democracies, that nobody is winning in this strategy started by President Trump in the United States.
Thank you so much, both of you, Mr. President,
Thank you.
for helping us understand your perspectives.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian. To conclude our special program, Global Governance, Wisdom from Leaders, we hear from former French Prime Minister Jean-Pierre Raffarin. As China-U.S. trade disputes make headlines, transatlantic ties are also under strain. Well, French President Emmanuel Macron appeared to have pulled off a few diplomatic feats at the recently concluded G7 summit regarding Iran and Ukraine. The EU as a whole is struggling to stay relevant in the presence of emerging economies, with Italy being the first G7 country to sign an MOU with the Belt and Road Initiative. Where does France stand? In our talk, Prime Minister Jean-Pierre Raffarin give his views on how China can coordinate with France in Africa and what he considered the nature of the BRI. Let's listen in. Mr. Prime Minister, what exactly will be the niche that France as a country sees in terms of the potential of Belt and Road Initiative? I know you are not signing the MOU yet, so where is France standing now?
I think that during the last visit of Mr. Xi Jinping in Paris, we have made a big progress with a very important meeting between Mr. Xi Jinping, Mrs. Merkel, Mr. Macron, and Mr. Jean-Claude Juncker. Both French and German want to work together in this project. So it's very important to have a European vision about Belt and Road. Of course, we have our French vision because we have some projects. For example, we are working about automatic subways in Paris, in Shanghai, and we work together, and we want to work in third country with such a concrete project. But also we need to have a European vision. And it was very important when we talk together, German, French and Chinese. And now we can speak about very concrete, very precise projects, just like bilateral cooperation in third countries. Cooperation in third country is very important in Belt and Road Initiative. So we are in progress.
How is France articulating its approach now with the European Union regarding, for example, infrastructure, regarding, for example, consensus building toward China, the so-called EU-China policy, if there is something like that, and also articulating EU's status today with France's input about its relationship across the Atlantic? I know this is a very strategic question, but
Yes.
this is a very important one.
I think it's the question right now.
Yeah.
The world is changing. I think we have a new balance of the world. Of course, our past is a past from West. And we have a lot of very old relationship between America. But right now, we are not sure that America is so friendly with Europe. We have some problems with America. For example, our French company can't work in Iran, for example, because a decision of America. So we have discussion.
In spite of JCPOA's earlier agreement.
Exactly. So we have discussion, hard discussion with America. And we don't want trade war. Trade war is a bad idea.
Yes.
To talk about trade war, it's probably that you have not a good knowledge of the war in your country. Because if you know the war in your country, you don't want war, even trade war. Because we need, of course, the growth of everybody for the global growth of the world. So, right now, we need to have not only a West vision for the future of Europe, but also an East vision. That's the reason why Belt and Road could be strategic.
Are those in conflict, though, the two visions, so-called West vision and the East vision?
We have to balance.
What do you mean by balance, Mr. Prime Minister?
Balance is to look more nowadays to the East than in the past.
Mr. Prime Minister, there is a very sophisticated debate about what is happening toward the so-called West, meaning the ally relationship, the traditional friendship between the European countries such as France and the United States. What do you make of the general trend of it? I'm not talking about one administration. I'm talking about middle and probably the long term, Mr. Prime Minister.
I think that Asia will be very important, strategic in the next world. And we need to give to Asia, but also to Africa, the place that they need and that is right to give up. So I think that we need to support a new vision of multilateralism. Of course, we need multilateralism. We need dialogues. Without dialogue, we will find wars. So this dialogue has to be organized, but with a new way. That's the reason why Mr. Guterres, the General Secretary of the United Nations, is working for a reform to have a new distribution of responsibilities in United Nations, even in Security Council. So we need to reform UNESCO, United Nations, WTO. We need to have a new reform to give rooms to Africa and to China. It's not easy to integrate people who are working in Africa, in the African society. It's not so easy. The culture of China, the culture of Africa is very different. The language is very different. For example, in a large part of Africa, they speak French. So we have some difficulties like that. But we know that...
For France, what is the difficulty?
It's our history. It's the role in the past of the France in Africa. So, but we know very well Africa, and we have a lot of friends, but we have our own difficulties. So, if China and France together are working with the different experiences, I think we can promote new projects with a lot of new opportunities in many countries. For example, in Africa, for example, you have shown to the world that China is able to develop some regions which are not easy to develop.
And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Inside CGTN into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Inside team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for more insights across China and around the world. Good night.